You are on the deck of a small ship in the summer of 1341, several days south of Lisbon, and the land rising out of the Atlantic haze ahead of you is not supposed to have anyone living on it. This is a Portuguese-backed expedition, Genoese and Castilian and Florentine men under a captain named Nicoloso de Recco, sent to survey a chain of islands that European mariners had been sighting, and occasionally raiding, for a generation without ever properly charting them. The account that survives was written up a few years later by the Florentine poet Giovanni Boccaccio, working from the sailors' own reports, and it reads with the freshness of something genuinely unexpected. As the ship's close on the shore, the crew sees terraced fields cut into the hillsides, herds of goats moving across the slopes, houses built of fitted dry stone, with smoke drifting up from cooking fires, and, on one island, a structure the sailors described as a chapel or a temple, carefully built, with a stone figure inside it. Then they see the people, tall, barefoot, dressed in stitched goatskins and palm fiber cloaks, gathering on the black rock beaches to watch the ships, some of them hurling stones with an accuracy and force that the sailors found genuinely frightening. A landing party goes ashore. A few islanders are seized and carried back to Lisbon, where educated men question them through gestures and study them with fascination. They sing sweetly, in harmony. They count out loud, and the words they use for 1, 2, 3, and the rest can be lined up by a modern linguist, almost 1 for 1, against the Berber languages still spoken across North Africa. And beyond those numbers, they speak a tongue that nobody on the European mainland can place at all. For the sailors and scholars nosing along this archipelago through the 14th century, though, the disorienting thing was never simply that the islands were inhabited. It was the character of that habitation. Here were people spread across 7 main islands and several smaller ones, scattered over nearly 300 miles of open ocean, some of the islands plainly visible from one another on a clear day, who lived without metal of any kind, without a pottery wheel, without a loom of the ordinary old-world type, without any writing they still actively used, and without seagoing boats. The inhabitants of El Hierro could look north across the water and see La Gomera. The people of Lanzarote could see Fuerteventura across a strait, La Bocaina, barely 7 miles wide and dotted with an islet partway across. And yet each island's population lived in near total isolation from every other, with its own dialect, its own kings, its own creation stories, its own gods under slightly different names, and essentially no traffic between them. A people whose ancestors had, beyond any possible doubt, crossed at least 60 miles of Atlantic Ocean to arrive in the first place had, by the time Europe came knocking, seemingly turned their backs on the sea completely. They are known to history, collectively and a little inaccurately, as the Guanches, a word that in the strict sense belongs only to the natives of Tenerife, where it appears to have meant something close to person or man of Tenerife. This is the story of who they were, how they might have got there, and how, across a single brutal century, they were raided, conquered, enslaved, baptized, and absorbed until they no longer existed as a distinct people at all. Almost every line of evidence about Guanche origins points in one direction, North Africa, and specifically the Amazigh, or Berber, world that stretched along the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts of what is now Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. The clues stack up and agree with one another. The numerals the chroniclers wrote down are transparently Berber. The islands are saturated with place names that resist any European reading but sit easily in a Berber sound world: Tenerife, Timanfaya, Guimar, Tacoronte, Galdar, Tejeda, Tide itself. Across several islands there are inscriptions cut into rock faces in a script closely related to Tifinagh, the alphabet still written by the Tuareg of the Central Sahara. The physical remains, once 19th-century racial theorizing was stripped away from them, describe a robust North African population rather than any exotic transatlantic one. And the whole way of life the Europeans found, pastoralists herding goats and sheep, growing barley where rainfall allowed, roasting and grinding their grain, making burnished hand-built pottery, working obsidian and bone and wood because there was no ore to work, was recognizably a transplanted piece of the ancient North African countryside, set down on volcanic islands and then left to develop on its own for more than 1,000 years. When exactly that transplant happened is far harder to fix. Radiocarbon dates from the earliest secure settlement layers cluster somewhere in the last centuries before the Common Era, with several islands apparently not permanently occupied until around the 1st century BCE or a little after, and archaeologists still argue over calibration and over samples of old wood that can push a date artificially early. Who carried the settlers there is harder still. The Guanches themselves left behind no seagoing craft worth the name, and no strong memory of one, which raises the genuine possibility that they did not arrive under their own sail. Phoenician and Carthaginian ships had been working down the Atlantic coast of Africa for centuries. The Carthaginian navigator Hanno is supposed to have sailed well past the Strait of Gibraltar around the 5th century BCE. Near the end of the 1st century BCE, the scholar King Juba II of Mauritania, a client of Rome and a compulsive collector of geographic facts, sent an expedition to the islands. The naturalist Pliny the Elder preserved its report, listing names for 6 of them and describing one as full of large dogs, 2 of which were brought back to Juba. The Latin word for dog, canis, is very probably the root of the name Canaria, and in time of the whole archipelago. There was a Roman period workshop on the tiny islet of Lobos, off Fuerteventura, crushing sea snails to make purple dye in the 1st century BCE, and Roman amphorae and other material have turned up on several islands. Rome, in other words, knew the Canaries were out there, touched them lightly, and then lost interest for centuries. Whether the Guanches were deportees dumped on the islands as punishment, exiles, deliberately planted colonists, or captives, or the descendants of people who came on their own boats and then simply let the skill lapse, nobody can say with confidence, and the sources of the conquest period offer several of those explanations at once. One late Roman writer claimed the coastal Berber tribes had had their tongues cut out by a foreign power and been shipped to islands in the ocean, a story almost certainly invented to explain a strange language, but a story that at least shows the idea of enforced exile to the Atlantic was already in circulation in antiquity. What ancient DNA can now say is narrower but firm. A genome-scale study of Aboriginal remains, published in 2019, placed the Guanches unambiguously among the Berbers of North Africa, carrying a modest sub-Saharan African component and a trace of the early Neolithic European farmers whose ancestry had itself spread into North Africa millennia earlier. The maternal lineages recovered from the mummies and cave burials are dominated by types, especially one labeled U6B1A, that are essentially specific to this population and its North African relatives. And there are consistent small genetic differences between islands, enough to suggest that the settlement was not one clean event but several, arriving over a span of time and perhaps from slightly different source populations. Then, at some point in the early centuries of the Common Era, contact with the mainland effectively stopped, and stayed stopped for more than 1,000 years, until a Genoese sailor named Lancelotto Molocello washed up on Lanzarote around the year 1312, stayed for years, built a small tower, and left the island his own first name, which it still carries. A Majorcan chart of 1339 already shows Lanzarote marked with a Genoese shield. Through the middle decades of the 14th century the islands filled the gap between rumor and target, Portuguese, Castilian, and Majorcan ships raided for slaves and skins, and in 1351 the papacy went so far as to create a bishopric of the Fortunate Islands, based nominally at Telde on Gran Canaria, and sent Catalan missionaries who baptized some islanders, opened a small mission, and were, by the end of the century, killed in a native reaction. When Bethencourt's ships arrived in 1402, in other words, the Guanches were not meeting Europeans for the first time. They had spent 3 or 4 generations learning that ships from the northeast meant, at best, disruption, and often men in chains. Life on the islands, reconstructed from the Conquest chronicles and from well over a century of archaeology, was materially spare and socially intricate. Goats stood at the center of everything, along with sheep, pigs, and dogs. Meat, milk, cheese, and hides came from the herds, and animals on the hoof were the main measure of wealth and rank. Where terrain and rain cooperated, people grew barley and some wheat, parched the grain over fire, and ground it on stone querns into a flour called gofio, which they worked with milk, water, broth, or honey into a stiff paste. Gofio is still eaten in the Canaries at breakfast today, an unbroken thread running straight from the aboriginal kitchen into the modern one. They gathered shellfish and limpets in enormous quantities, fished from the rocks, and collected wild figs, ferns, and the fruit of the matsan tree. Bad years brought real famine, and the burial record carries the marks of periodic hunger. They made pottery entirely by hand, some of it thin-walled, painted, and carefully burnished, and modeled small clay figures, the most celebrated being the seated female idol from Gran Canaria known as the Idolo de Terra. They pressed geometric designs onto skin and perhaps cloth with fired clay stamps called pintadoras, whose purpose is still debated, from body decoration to marks of property or identity. Their cutting edges were flakes of obsidian, called tabona, sharp enough to shave with, backed up by basalt, bone, goat horn, and fire-hardened wood. There was no metal at all, on islands with no accessible ore. They lived in natural lava tube caves, many of them fitted out with stone benches, sleeping niches, and dividing walls, and in semi-subterranean dry stone houses roofed with timber and slabs. On Gran Canaria there are whole settlements carved into soft volcanic rock, and remarkable communal granaries. At Cenobio de Vailron, hundreds of small sealed storage cells honeycomb a cliff face beneath a natural rock visor, a fortified bank vault for grain. At Risco-Cato, now listed by UNESCO, a chamber cut into the rock admits a slow blade of sunlight that moves around the wall through the year, apparently tracking the seasons. Politically, each island was its own world. Tenerife was divided into 9 kingdoms, each ruled by a mensi, with a body of nobles and a council. Gran Canaria was led by figures called guanartemes at the rival centers of Galdar and Telde, advised by a priest, the Fakan, and a council of elders that met in a ring of stones called a tagora. La Gomera was split among 4 groups. There were nobles and commoners, herdsmen and cave-dwelling recluses, and consecrated women on Gran Canaria, the haremaguadas, associated with ritual and with places of refuge. Justice was communal and often severe. Combat was formalized, duels with stones and long staves and fire-hardened javelins called banet, fought on set ground with rules, and warriors so sure-footed on near-vertical terrain that they crossed ravines by vaulting on long wooden lances, a technique, the shepherd's leap, still practiced in the Canaries as a sport. Religion centered on a high god, called Achaman on Tenerife and by other names elsewhere, together with reverence for the sun, for sacred peaks, and for a malevolent power lodged in the volcano tide, named Guayota, who in one account seized the sun and was forced by the god to release it. The year turned on a harvest festival the chroniclers on Gran Canaria called Benesman, held at the end of summer when the grain was in, a time of feasting, judgment, and marriage. Some accounts describe brides of the nobility being secluded and deliberately fattened on milk beforehand as a mark of status, and describe marriage as monogamous and divorce as possible, with property and, on parts of Gran Canaria and Lanzarote, succession itself passing through the mother's line. On La Gomera, whose surface is torn into gorges so deep that walking from one hamlet to the next can take hours, people talked across the ravines by whistling, a real system with the force of speech, audible for a mile or more. Their descendants carried that whistling over onto Spanish and kept it alive as Silbo Gomero. The dead were treated with extraordinary care, and it is here that the Guanches enter the popular imagination. On Tenerife and Gran Canaria above all, the bodies of the elite were preserved by a process the Spanish later called merlado, washing the corpse, drawing out the internal organs, drying it slowly in the sun and over low smoky fires or with salt and absorbent plant matter across a stretch of days, then rubbing it with a compound of animal fat, melted pine resin, powdered pumice or volcanic earth, and aromatic herbs, packing the cavities, and finally sewing it into a close-fitted shroud of goat and sheep skins, a zaxo, worked with the fur turned in and stitched with leather thread. The wrapped body was laid on a wooden bier and carried deep into a dry, hard-to-reach burial cave, often on a ledge in a ravine wall, sometimes joining dozens or hundreds of others already resting there. One site on Tenerife, in the Barranco de Herx, was described by early chroniclers as a cave holding something like 1,000 mummified bodies. Its exact position was either kept deliberately secret by the families who used it or genuinely lost, and despite repeated searches it has never been convincingly relocated. If a Stone Age people, marooned or perhaps deliberately set down on volcanic islands far out in the open Atlantic, mummifying their dead in cliff caves through a tradition nobody has fully explained, is the kind of story that holds your attention in the dark, then this channel is built for exactly that. New episodes on vanished peoples, unsolved sites, and the slow, patient work of reconstructing what actually happened go up regularly, so if you would like more nights spent drifting through stories like this one, this is a good moment to subscribe before we climb back up to the caves. Most of the mummies that were found did not survive the centuries after contact. Through the 16th and 17th centuries they were ground into a brown powder called mumia and sold across Europe as medicine, a trade that consumed Egyptian bodies by the shipload and Canarian ones too. Through the 18th and 19th centuries they were carried off as curiosities and museum pieces. The French naturalists Sabin Berthelot and Philip Barker Webb, cataloguing the islands in that period, watched caves being emptied. Of what may once have numbered well over 1,000 preserved bodies, only a few dozen remain, the most famous of them lifted from the Herx cave and presented to King Carlos III of Spain, where it still lies in Madrid. What survives of the wider population now sits mostly in study collections. The Museo Canario in Las Palmas alone holds well over 1,000 crania, most of them gathered in the 19th century by local physicians and antiquarians who measured skulls in the language of the era's race science and, in the process of doing so, stripped hundreds of caves. The result is a strange inversion. The Guanches are one of the more thoroughly sampled pre-modern populations anywhere, in bone and now in genome, and yet almost none of that material is still where the people who made these burials chose to put it. The comparison with Egypt is unavoidable and mostly dissolves on inspection. The resemblances are broad, there is no evidence of any contact between the two traditions, and the likelier explanation is that a pastoral people already expert at scraping, curing, and stitching skins, living among bone-dry volcanic caves, worked out their own answer to the problem of keeping the dead present. A more stubborn puzzle sits at Guimar, on the east coast of Tenerife, where 6 rectangular stepped platforms of stacked lava stone stand on what was once open ground. In the 1990s, the Norwegian adventurer Thor Heyerdahl, who lived nearby, argued that they were deliberate ceremonial structures, oriented to the solstices, and possibly meaningful for his lifelong theory of transatlantic voyaging. A foundation was set up and the site turned into an ethnographic park. Canarian archaeologists and astronomers have pushed back hard, and the mainstream reading is far more sober. Heaps of field-clearing stone stacked by farmers in the 19th century, a practice documented all over the islands, with pottery of that period found under one of the platforms. Yet a genuine double solstice alignment does appear to run through the complex, and the debate has never quite closed. Then there are the inscriptions. On Fuerteventura, El Hierro, La Palma, Gran Canaria, and elsewhere, rock faces carry strings of Libyco-Berber letters, and in places a second, more cursive script sometimes called Latino-Canarian. Specialists can transliterate the Libyco-Berber sign sound by sound, because the alphabet is known from North Africa. But the language they encode cannot be securely read, and the texts are short and without translations, so the inscriptions remain, in every practical sense, undeciphered, a written voice from the islands that we can sound out letter by letter and still not understand a word of. Alongside them, and probably older and unrelated, are the pure geometric traditions, spirals and meanders and grids pecked into cave walls at Belmico and La Zarza on La Palma, whose meaning is entirely open. The conquest began in 1402, when 2 Norman lords, Jean de Bethencourt and Gadifer de la Salle, sailed south under the crown of Castile and landed on Lanzarote. The chronicle of that campaign, Le Canarien, survives in 2 rival versions written by chaplains attached to the expedition, each slanted toward one of the 2 quarreling leaders, and it is the first sustained European account of the islands from the inside. Lanzarote's people, already thinned and wary after decades of slave raids by earlier freebooters and by the failed Major Can missions of the previous century, were subdued fairly quickly, partly by exploiting a split between a chief and his brother. Fuerteventura fell after a harder, multi-year campaign. On El Hierro, according to the sources, the islanders were coaxed into the open under a promise of peace by an interpreter who was one of their own, and then seized and carried off almost as a body into slavery. These early conquests were a private, seigneurial business, small forces playing rival island factions against each other, alliances made and broken, and always, running underneath, the trade in human beings for the markets of Seville and Valencia, where Canarian became a recognized category of slave. Popes issued bulls both blessing the enterprise as a mission and, at moments, condemning the enslavement of converts. Neither had much effect on the ground. La Gomera was never truly conquered in open battle. It was brought under the lordship of the Peraza family across the century and held by a single fortified tower and a web of coerced alliances with its 4 native groups, and it rose in revolt again and again. When Hernan Peraza the Younger was killed by Gomerans in 1488, in a mountain cave where he had gone to meet a woman of the island named Ibala in violation of local custom, the reprisal under the governor Pedro de Vera was ferocious. Mass hangings, mutilations, men thrown from the cliffs, and hundreds of islanders, including many who had taken no part in the rising, shipped off and sold, a punishment so extreme that it drew formal complaint back in Castile. Gran Canaria took the crown itself to subdue. The royal conquest opened in 1478 with the founding of a fortified camp, the Real de las Palmas, and then ground on for 5 years, slowed by feuding between its own commanders before Pedro de Vera took firm charge. The Canarians fought hard and well. Their war leader Doramas was killed leading a counterattack at Arucas in 1481. What finally broke the resistance was internal, the capture, and then the genuine cooperation, of the Guanarteme Tensor Semidan, baptized Fernando Guanarteme, who returned to the island as a Castilian ally and talked his own people into terms. In April 1483 the last holdouts gathered at the mountain fastness of Ancite, handed over a boy heir, and surrendered. 2 leaders, rather than be taken, are said to have run off the edge into the ravine, shouting a phrase remembered as atis terma, an appeal to their land or their god. That left Tenerife, with the largest population and the last free ground. Its 9 kingdoms split into a faction that came to terms early, the peace bands of Anaga, Guimar, Adage, and Abona, and a war faction led by Taro, the richest kingdom, under its Menci Bencomo. Alonso Fernández de Lugo, fresh from conquering La Palma between 1492 and 1493 with financing from Genoese merchants in Seville, landed on Tenerife in May 1494 with perhaps 2,000 foot and a few dozen horse and marched inland toward Taro. In a steep, wooded ravine at Acentejo the Guanches, who knew every stone of the ground, let the column march in and then fell on it from the heights with rocks, javelins, and staves. The Castilian force was broken, contemporary estimates of the dead run to 900 or 1,000, one of the heaviest single defeats Castile suffered anywhere in its Atlantic expansion. Bencomo's brother Tinguaro is remembered as the architect of the ambush. Lugo himself got out with a wound to the face and a remnant of his men, and the place is called La Matanza de Acentejo, the slaughter of Acentejo, to this day. In the fighting over the following year Tinguaro was killed and, the sources say, beheaded. Bencomo drops out of the record around the same time, at Aguirre, or before it, with no clear account of how he died, and his son Benter, holding out afterward in the heights, is said to have ended by throwing himself from a cliff rather than surrender. The reprieve was short, and it was undone less by soldiers than by disease. Through 1494 and 1495 an epidemic the Spanish called the modorra, the drowsiness or the heavy sleep, moved through the Guanches, who had no immunity to whatever it was, and emptied whole districts. Historians have proposed typhus, a dysentery, or some other infection carried in by the invaders, and the true identity is still argued. When Lugo returned late in 1495 with fresh troops, horses, and money, he met a people already gutted from within. He won a pitched battle on the open plain at Aguirre, near modern La Laguna, in November, and in December a second fight at Acentejo, on almost the same ground as the first, produced the opposite result. Through 1496 the surviving mencies came down and submitted. The chroniclers sorted them into the peace kings and the war kings, and several were shipped to the Spanish court and presented to Ferdinand and Isabella before being allowed, in some cases, to return. Lugo took formal possession of the island in 1496. The conquest of the Canary Islands, begun on a Lanzarote beach 94 years earlier, was over. On Tenerife it left behind, among other things, a detail the Spanish found unsettling, a wooden statue of the Virgin Mary that Guanche shepherds were said to have found on a beach and venerated in a cave for most of a century before the conquerors arrived, now the island's patron as the Virgin of Candelaria. What followed the conquest was not, in the main, extermination, though enslavement was massive and its unwinding was slow. Legal fights over which Guanches had surrendered peacefully, and had therefore been enslaved illegally, dragged through the courts for decades. A bishop and royal officials secured the freedom of some, while others stayed in bondage or were sold on to the mainland and never recovered. The survivors on the islands were baptized, given new names, resettled onto marginal land under the repartimiento that handed the best ground to Castilian, Portuguese, and Genoese settlers, and married into the population that poured in with the island's new sugar economy, a workforce that included many enslaved Africans. Within 2 or 3 generations the Guanches as a distinct people were gone. Their language went with them, leaving no continuous text, a few hundred recorded words, the numerals, a stock of personal names, and an extraordinary density of place names that Canarians pronounce every day without translating. 19th-century Canarian writers, looking for a local identity distinct from Spain, would build a romantic cult around the vanished Guanche, all noble mensaes and doomed last stands, that flattened the real people into a symbol. And yet the erasure was less total than the word conquest implies. When geneticists began sampling the modern population, they found the Aboriginal line still running strongly through the maternal side, depending on the island. Somewhere between a quarter and roughly half of Canarian mitochondrial lineages descend from the people who were there before 1402, with the indigenous share highest on the islands conquered earliest and by treaty. Across the whole genome the modern islanders are majority mainland European by ancestry, but they carry a substantial and unmistakable North African component that traces straight back to the Guanches, alongside a smaller sub-Saharan African contribution from the era of the sugar plantations. The people were displaced and dissolved, a measurable part of their ancestry is still on the islands, in the islanders. Some threads were consciously picked back up. Silbo Gomero, the whistled speech of La Gomera's ravines, nearly died out in the 20th century as roads and telephones spread, and was then deliberately revived, made a required subject in the island schools at the end of the 1990s, protected by regional law, and inscribed by UNESCO in 2009, so that a way of communicating older than the Spanish it now carries is once again being learned by children on the same clifftops. The shepherd's leap is a competitive sport with regional federations. Gofio is milled commercially and eaten daily. But the questions at the center of the story are still open, and honest archaeology leaves them that way. We do not know, within a few centuries, when the first people reached the islands, or whether they came in one movement or several, though the genetic differences between islands point toward more than one. We do not know who brought them, if anyone did, or whether some of them arrived under their own sail and others were carried. Above all, we do not know why a people who had crossed open ocean to get there ended up, 1,000 years later, with no seagoing boats at all, and on several islands apparently no working memory that the sea between the islands could be crossed, whether the knowledge simply died out in a small founding group, whether the islands they landed on lacked timber large and workable enough for real boats, whether the effort was abandoned once the herds were established, or whether turning away from the water was in some way a choice. And we do not know how many Guanches died in the wars and the modorra, set against how many walked down out of the hills, were baptized, and became the ancestors of the people who live there now. The islands kept the names, the food, the whistling, and a real share of the blood. The rest is still up in the ravines, wrapped in stitched goatskin, in caves some of which have never been found again.